Welcome to The Sound of Economics. My name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director of Bruegel. And today I'm joined by Padmashree Gehl Sampath, who is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. Welcome, Padmashree.
Thank you. Thank you, Gunther.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us today. We are today discussing at a larger event industrial policy in the digital age. And Padmashree, you gave a presentation on Industrial Policy 4.0, some reflections on EU policymaking for the EU. And what I thought was very interesting, you started off with a chart saying that machine learning changes fundamentally the nature of the internet and that this has ultimately significant repercussions for industrial policy, industrial structures. So why don't you walk our listeners through your main argument?
Thanks. Yeah. So, I tried to do a lot of work on trying to understand actually the nature of innovation in the digital economy, because a lot of people have been talking about whether it's changed, how it's changed, whether it works or not. And one of the things that I started with was the nature of internet itself, in the third industrial revolution, so to speak. And the two important characteristics of the internet is its decentralization and autonomy. So, lack of any central control. That's what made internet such a powerful tool for business, for society. And when you compare that to what's happening to innovation in the digital economy today, what you see is really that in the internet, the largest layer and the most significant layer is really your hardware. And then other things, applications, infrastructure, they build on it. And applications come right on top of the pyramid. They're the smallest part. If you take new technologies in the digital economy, like machine learning, this gets totally inverted. So the hardware is right at the bottom, and then on top of that, you have software which builds on it, like TensorFlow from Google or Azure from Microsoft or deep learning software. And then you have machine learning applications like Loop or, Google machine learning or, SkyMind. And then you have applications on top, which stack on. And the important problem in this is that as you have go up and up towards applications, everything is privatized. So although it builds on the internet, which is supposedly public and decentralized, everything that comes today in terms of machine learning is entirely privatized. And if you do the same exercise for Internet of Things or cyber of physical systems, you see the same trend. You see actually how the internet, from being a decentralized portal for communication and business, is now leading to more centralized technological domains where you have actually accumulation of power.
Well, can you explain perhaps to our listener a little bit more what you mean with privatized? So the internet, of course, the way we sort of traditionally think about it, is a free place. It's a decentralized place. Everybody can access everything for free, basically. And of course, there's a big debate at the moment in Europe on copyright. How can we make sure that sort of copyright rents continue to be paid to the producer of original content? Now, in machine learning, you are saying this is actually not the case anymore. And you're saying machine learning applications manage to privatize, so centralize data, centralize information, and extract rents. So can you explain a little bit more what is the mechanism and how does this work really?
Right. So, most of the innovation you see in the digital economy is data-driven, right? So data, basically, when individual users use the internet, they create sort of this data is flowing from these decentralized nodes where you use the internet to centralized places. If you use Google platforms, it's going to Google. If you're on Facebook, it goes to Facebook. In these places, what happens is that these decentralized flows of data get centralized, basically, and that becomes actually very valuable data sets. So even if information on you is anonymized, and used. You become a very important data point in this data set, and it becomes a useful basis for predicting and forecasting certain kinds of trends, or for creating machine learning applications, where these data sets become training programs for computers to understand what happens, how people react in certain situations, and then you have these applications that come out of it. But the applications per se, the machine learning applications, they're privatized because they are based on the training data that is pooled by these companies. They are tested and they are created as applications, and they are sold back to you. So if you use, say, Jupyter Notebook, you're using a machine learning program which has been sold back to you, or it's sold to businesses. So that privatizes the data, creates a new innovation from it, and sells it back.
Now, if we take this sort of framework and think about it, what it means for the European economy and especially the European industrial policy, I think one of the points you made today is that Europe lacks specialization in that kind of industry that is strong in machine learning, strong in AI, and that has more far-reaching implications for the European economy. So can you enlarge a little bit? I mean, there's different. I think you basically had a classification that there's 4 different types of companies, and that Europe is actually quite weak in some of those companies. And where would you put an accent then in terms of industrial policy?
So, there are different models of operating in the digital economy. The classic model is, to digitize manufacturing, so-called smart manufacturing, which is something that a large number of European countries are doing, and they're very good at it. So take the case of Germany, and you have Germany invented the notion of smart manufacturing through the Industry 4.0 policy framework, and those firms there. So Europe has a large number of digital companies which are very specialized. They're at the frontier, and they are doing very, very good business. And these kinds of smart manufacturing techniques, they also help companies to collect data. Okay, so and that can be used to do, this kind of machine learning applications or Internet of Things or other kinds of digital economy applications and innovations. But there are other kinds of innovation that are missing in Europe. For instance, let me give you a simple example, Uber. Right? Uber operates in the US, but it also operates globally elsewhere, okay, or Lyft, And Europe made a decision not to allow Uber or Lyft in several cities, right? And now what happens when you don't allow Uber and Lyft in several cities is that Uber has all this data on how traffic functions. Okay, it has all this Lyft the same. So these companies, or if you go to China, you have alternate providers. These companies have data on how traffic flows, how cities function, what is this nature of parking, this data that is collected. And they also have data on individual citizens' use, how much they travel, where they go, where are the routes, and if there are differences between different kinds of people. Because when you set up a Uber account, you have to give a lot of details, and it's a consistent pattern. So these patterns, you see, these are the kind of data sets that are relevant when you want to do city planning and when you want to do how are you going to build better cities and so on. So if you have individual taxi drivers and you don't have these centralized data nodes, okay, you are automatically not benefiting from that. So that's one thing I can say. So those different kinds of innovation models, they're important. Now, whether the government centralizes it, says, all taxi drivers should have these kind of, data collection mechanisms, and we're going to use that, make it available to everybody, create a level playing field for better city organization or not, that's a different model. That's a question for European industrial policy. But these kinds of platform economy models, they're important. Mm-hmm. The same thing with, social media websites, the kind of data they collect, okay? So Europe is lagging behind on these other kinds of platform economy innovation, right? Now, this raises a couple of questions questions for industrial policy. One is something I already talked about. Do you want to create the same kind of large firms in Europe to collect data? You need a European Uber? No. The answer would be probably that you need actually the government to take the lead, or certain agencies to take the lead, collect the data, and make it equally available for everybody, for the firms and for people, for cities to devise better kinds of life in the digital economy. Second thing for Europe is that how do you break these monopolies? Because these companies already have the data. So the companies that don't have the data, they need access to this data. And this data is flowing out of everywhere. I mean, all Europeans still use Facebook. We all go on Google. And, this data still travels. So how do you create actually a level playing field? Can there be a basis for a European industrial policy to intervene globally and say, we want this data to be universally available for innovations by all firms and not to be concentrated in the hands of a top few companies?
Well, just to sort of pick up on a few points that you made. I mean, one point is certainly that Europe still has its strengths in industrial manufacturing, AI and data collection, and has actually quite a bit of applications that allow machine-to-machine communication. And, in that space, the data that is being collected is probably still in the hands of Europeans, even though there are risks there, obviously, and certainly that's a big debate when it comes to the car industry, where there is a fear that increasingly, let's say, at least the cars, once they leave the manufacturing hall, then will sort of become the data that these cars will generate will not be appropriated anymore by the car industry itself. But let's say for the manufacturing process itself, so far Europe basically still, if I understand you correctly, has a hold on the data. While on the consumer side, so be it social media, be it business to consumer applications, Europe seems to be lagging behind. And you raised therefore a valid point. I mean, how can Europe make sure that it doesn't lose out on that race? Now, let me push you sort of on what GDPR, so the European Data Protection Regulation, can achieve in that space, because GDPR is not only a high standard for privacy, for individual privacy, giving you as a consumer, as a citizen, a lot of rights, how you control your data. It is also a possibility for you as a consumer to actually request data from all the companies with which you interact. And I think what could happen is that actually we see a new ecosystem emerging where consumers will increasingly say, well, wait a minute, this is my data and I want to grant a certain company, a certain service access to all of my individual, let's say, health data, so that they can be aggregated and that I actually am in control of what's happening. So there could be a totally new industry emerging thanks to data protection regulation in Europe, which arguably is one of the strongest in the world.
I would say GDPR is a very good starting point, but I would say it's not enough, because I think that there's active and passive data that we give out, okay? For most people, going to the internet is synonymous with going to Google. So when you go into Google and you type in some search words, you're not giving anybody access to anything. Google is automatically collecting these trends and this information. But on the other hand, there are cases where you have to actively allow people to collect your data, and there GDPR is making strides. But where you are passively just by being on an app, just by using WhatsApp, just by going to Google, just by going to Amazon and ordering things, where you're sort of giving out data, that kind of stuff GDPR is not doing enough to cover. The other question for me is also that shouldn't we go much more ahead? Shouldn't we, have additional protection in addition to the GDPR? I'll tell you why. And that's another issue I raised in my presentation, is that is data information or is data knowledge? And if data is knowledge, okay, so why should some companies benefit from it over others? Why should some companies get to collect all of that? Okay. And if that is happening, then how do you create that level playing field? And I think those are questions that we are far away from answering for the moment. I know that there are some initiatives in Germany which are trying to actually ask these questions, and they're trying to see whether there can be policy interventions for this. And I think those are relevant interventions. We have to start thinking about that. I mean, if you take a phone, you take your iPhone or you take an Android phone and you walk in somewhere, or you have it in your pocket all the time, and if that phone is used to track you, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And what happens to the rights of European citizens the moment they leave Europe? Assume you leave Europe, go to US or China, you're traveling. What happens to the data you create there? So.
Right. I mean, that's very much a privacy point, but it's also, as you rightly say, it's a question of knowledge and who owns the knowledge. But let me perhaps, as a last question, ask you about sort of the let's say the basis for new industries to emerge, which is basically more let's not say the physical, but the human capital basis. I mean, there's a reason why we don't have a Silicon Valley in Europe. And it seems to me there's a whole question of what are the capabilities in terms of AI capacities of our scholars, of our business people, of our firms. We've heard today, for example, that in terms of productivity performance, I mean, this is not even a only European problem. We see that productivity of some big firms is really accelerating very rapidly, while a lot of medium-sized companies actually find it difficult to adapt new technologies and really boost their productivity quite strongly. And a recent survey of the German Industry Association, BDI, of German firms shows that most small and medium-sized German firms know that digitalization, AI applications are the future and that they should be doing it, but they don't know how to do it. And so they find it difficult to actually move ahead and really boost their productivity. So it seems to me, I mean, beyond, let's say, the regulatory issue and who owns the data and these kind of questions, there is a real question about the ecosystem. How many people do we have? What kind of universities do we have? Do we have the startup scene? Can you say a few words of what's your take on that, and what should Europe do to boost that?
I think that's a very important question, and I think that comes back to the point I made earlier, is that Europe has different kinds of data actually, because you have all these manufacturing firms which are doing smart manufacturing and they're collecting this data, and this data is not probably about business to consumer regular kind of habits or practices, but it's related to those particular sensors, that are embedded in different kinds of applications that are being sold. So one thing is that to do more kind of work in machine learning, and you need more interdisciplinarity. You need different kinds of skills, and we talked about it in the panel just now. Is the question of how do you boost those skills? How do you make actually this kind of interaction more agile in universities and research institutes, and how do you encourage firms to use the data that they are collecting in a more sort of, smart way, so to speak, for lack of another word. They have the data and that could be used for other innovations. So so the skills part is going to be very important in that. I think that universities need to really ramp up the skills creation aspect. The other one is to really create more interdisciplinary agencies or institutes that can work with firms to increase awareness on how this kind of stuff can be used. A third thing would be actually the way capital markets function, because I think that the way we are thinking about innovation in the digital economy is still very conventional in Europe. And I think that you need to give space for different kinds of innovations to emerge. And that would be important, I would say.
Well, so we talked about obviously how to improve the framework conditions, the university education, and so on. But of course, there's also an important role that competition policy plays in industrial policy and in this data space of industrial policy. Can you tell us a bit what you think is the role of competition policy, both ex post and what kind of role it plays currently in Europe, and what you think it should be playing and how it should evolve to address these issues better?
Yeah, I think competition policy in Europe is functioning quite well in an ex post scenario to consider whether, this kind of data power leads to market power and whether certain kinds of activity should be allowed. You have the recent EU judgments for Google, which are actually quite interesting, and the fines that were imposed against the top 5 firms, I think these are good examples. But I think what is not working, and I think this is important, is that it's not just that these firms collect the data and they have the data with them. That oversimplifies the problem. I think there are 2 things that are going on. These data flows, they get centralized, but more importantly, firms are continuously devising more pervasive applications that collect more and more data, because that's useful for them to do other kinds of innovations in machine learning or other digital domains. That's a big problem. 2 is that when firms do that, it affects businesses because they're able to segment primary and secondary markets in certain ways. And that leads to actually anti-competitive rents in markets. So you need competition policy to step in much more firmly right at the start and to lay out certain ground rules in the digital economy. And I think this needs to be done very firmly in the context of EU competition policy, because right now the burden is on ex post trying to figure out whether in particular individual cases, certain kinds of lines have been crossed. And there are a lot of theoretical debates on this, because a lot of people say, competition policy should not intervene ex ante because the kind of market power and what happens, it's individual, it's case-based, and so on. My position would be that competition policy does have to lay out some ground rules, and then you still need actually oversight, but you still need these ground rules in the digital economy.
And why is this competition policy? I mean, I would have thought you would talk about regulatory policy ex ante and competition policy basically applying ex post. And how would you make sure also that the dynamism and the many useful projects that emerge out of new data, right? I mean, once you have data, only once you have them, you actually generate new business models, new ideas that are actually welcome and that citizens cherish and love. So how do you make sure that, you get the balance right here?
That's the reason why I think it needs to be done ex ante, because I think that somehow this framework of how data is collected, stored, used, how long data is kept with these companies, for what purposes it's used, and whether it's available to everybody who innovates, all businesses, or whether it's only available to the top few firms. These are questions that we are not addressing. And these are questions that are important from an individual perspective, in the privacy debate, yes, but these are also questions that are important from a business perspective. And how does data build on each other? So if a firm has already access to certain kinds of XYZ data, and now it introduces new applications, with 4 more kinds of data collection modes, does that really augment its power or not? We don't know that. And I think we need to create somehow a basic framework where we say these kinds of activities are not allowed and these kinds of activities are allowed, or this is okay. As a society, we accept that, and that debate needs to happen.
Well, Padmashree, thank you very much. I think this we could go on for 4 hours, but I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and also for participating in our conference today. It was a pleasure to discuss with you.
Thank you, Gunther. Thank you very much.
Thank you.